I am instructed to begin with certainty, so let this stand as the final moment in which certainty belonged wholly to me. My name is Davis, formerly attached investigator, 12 Legion compliance oversight, seconded from the Officio Militaris to observe, objectively, dispassionately, the operational discipline of the World Eaters in the years following the deed at Scalathrax. I record this initial statement in keeping with my duty to the Imperium, with unclouded reason and unwavering devotion to his will. At least, that is the position I occupied when I first opened the sealed crate that contained the primary documents. That is the position I believe myself to occupy. This confession, if that is what it is, was not intended for open circulation. It was meant for the restricted vaults where things are placed to be forgotten. But archive servitors malfunction, cogitators misfile, and sometimes a record, a forbidden record, is recovered unexpectedly. If you have found this, then understand, I did not mean for anyone to hear how my voice began to change. The oversight mandate seemed simple. The World Eaters, though brutal, were still Astartes, still bound by Gene Oath and Legion protocol. Their history was steeped in sanctioned violence, but violence in the name of Himantera remains a virtue. At the time, I treated the assignment as a routine administrative necessity, merely ensuring that the Legion's excesses did not impede broader strategic directives. The brutality referenced in their dossier was a quantifiable factor, a measurable variable. I was loyal, rational, armed with data. Yet even then, there were warnings. The senior archivist who handed me the first reel of restricted Vox logs spoke with the quiet reluctance of one who had already stood where I was standing. He kept tapping the side of the data slate with a single tremoring finger, as if trying to shake loose the very memory of the content. He told me formally, of course, but with a strange emphasis, that the World Eaters presented cognitive hazards to uninitiated personnel. I dismissed this. Cognitive hazards are for psychers and fools who delve into the warp without sanction. I was neither. I believed categorizations and control structures existed to contain such dangers, and I trusted them. I trusted myself. The first document I reviewed was a transcribed interview with an apothecary of the 12 Legion, one who still clung to the dying practice of recording his observations for the sake of posterity. What struck me, even then, was the tone. It was calm, almost tender. He described the implantation of the butcher's nails as if recounting a sacred rite. He spoke of necessary pain, and the purity of purpose, and the mercy of the silencing. I remember pausing, unsettled not by the content, but by the phrasing. The nails were crude, invasive, a violation of human neuroanatomy. Yet he described them not as tools, but as an idea made manifest. I archived that observation mentally, intending to revisit it later. But later never functioned in the way I expected. Later began to slide forward, closer, invading the present. Each successive document pressed inward, as though the archive itself wanted to collapse the distance between my understanding and something deeper, something I had not yet agreed to perceive. I found patterns in testimonies left by non-Astartes personnel, medici, logisticians, remembrancers, who reported a similar phenomenon while documenting the World Eaters. A drift, subtle at first, in their own thought structures. They described adopting Legion phrasing without noticing. They reported waking with phrases echoing in their minds that they did not remember reading. Mercy of the silencing, purity of purpose, necessary pain. It is vital, to note that at this early stage, I still regarded these accounts with professional detachment. I marked each anomalous pattern with standardized notation. I cross-referenced them with known mimetic contamination vectors. They did not match. They were not warborn. They were not sent by any external entity. They formed a system self-perpetuating through language, memory, and the slow erosion of one's own unexamined assumptions. I had been assured at the outset that my assignment was observational. Chart the downward trajectory of the Legion's internal cohesion, assess the long-term viability of their combat doctrine, and deliver recommendations. But now, reviewing these records, I noticed something curious. Every observer before me had delivered recommendations that were, in their final conclusion, identical. Not similar. Identical. The phrasing repeated across years, worlds, names, perfectly, as though produced from a single template. And these observers had no contact with one another. The recommendation was always this: continued observation is required to fully understand the underlying rationale driving the Legion's behavior. No operational reform suggested. No disciplinary structure proposed. Only the insistence that further observation was necessary. At first I believed this to be a bureaucratic failing, an institutional reluctance to act decisively. But the deeper I went into the sealed archive, the more I saw that the observers themselves had changed between their initial and final entries. Their diction shifted. Their syntax elongated. They began to repeat certain phrases, looping them with a rhythm akin to a chant or a constructed pattern of thought. I could not yet see what this implied, or perhaps I refused to, because loyalty, once declared, can make one blind, because reason, once trusted absolutely, becomes the first structure to erode when one encounters a truth shaped to dissolve structures. The final item of Part 1 is the one I resisted reviewing until now. A simple request for reassignment submitted by my predecessor. The reason stated was brief, almost painfully so. The brutality of the World Eaters is not what we think it is. He wrote nothing else. No clarification. No elaboration on what he believed it was. I remember staring at that line longer than I should have. The simplicity of it unsettled me more than any blood-stained hololith or battlefield report could have. Brutality is quantifiable. Brutality is an action, a consequence. But he implied something else, something systemic, ideological, perhaps even conceptual, something that transformed those who studied it, something I had now begun to study. This concludes the first portion of my statement. I remain confident, at this moment of recording, that my perspective is intact, that my loyalty is unaltered, that I am simply conducting an investigation, nothing more. Yet I feel compelled to note, strictly for the sake of completeness, that I have caught myself whispering, without conscious intention, a phrase from those early documents. It surfaces when I wake. It lingers beneath my breathing when I read the next file. Necessary pain. I do not yet know why the words feel reassuring. If Part 1 represented the portion of my testimony in which I still believed in the clarity of observation, believed that an investigator could stand outside the subject and look inward, then this second portion marks the point at which I first suspected that the archive did not merely contain information, but that it produced a kind of gravity. To open one document was to feel compelled toward the next, as though the records wished to be consumed in sequence, pulling the reader deeper with the steady persistence of a tide. After I delivered my initial report, I expected routine oversight. Instead, the reviewing officer returned my slate with a short, uncharacteristically terse remark. Proceed. Full transcription required. No amendments. No questions. No commentary. It was as though he had not read my concerns at all. At the time, I interpreted this as bureaucratic indifference, a familiar form of institutional decay. Yet now, recalling the glassy stillness of his expression, the way he avoided meeting my eyes, I find myself unsettled by the possibility that he may have understood the implications too clearly, that perhaps he knew what the archive would do if I continued, and that he wished, for reasons I still struggle to articulate, not to interfere. Necessary pain. The phrase surfaced again as I began my next session of review. This time I did not attempt to silence it. The second cluster of documents concerned behavioral deviation reports collected from auxiliary human personnel assigned to the World Eaters during the early Great Crusade. What was immediately striking was how early the pattern began, long before the more publicized tragedies, long before Scalifrax, long before the nails reached their later iterations. These were individuals who had never undergone implantation, never fought alongside the Legion in prolonged campaigns, never witnessed the frenzies that historians retroactively position as inevitable. They simply worked near the 12th Legion, maintaining munition stores, preparing void ship berths, reviewing tactical data. And yet they, too, began to change. One early report described a logistician who developed an unusual compulsion to reorder inventory lists according to what he called the cadence of escalation. When questioned, he claimed the pattern felt obvious, though he could not articulate why. Another auxiliary worker began reciting strings of numbers under his breath, always in groups of 8. 8, 16, 32. Whenever he passed the birthing decks assigned to the Legion, he insisted he was not counting anything he saw. He was counting something else, something he felt. A third assistant, remembrancer tasked with documenting the Legion's early campaigns, submitted a private letter to an acquaintance in which she described an unsettling sense that the World Eaters possessed a logic more honest than ours. She insisted that brutality was not brutality at all, but rather a stripping away of the facades that delude most men. The letter was intercepted. She was reassigned. I found her later entry in a medical ledger: psychological instability, compulsive ideation, repeated references to clarity. The phrasing across these documents echoed in ways I could not explain. Cadence, escalation, logic, clarity, patterns of cognition shifting towards something more precise, more singular. I reminded myself then that this was not warp taint. It bore none of the markers: no telepathic residue, no emanations detected by sanctioned psychers, no evidence of demonic intrusion. This was something else, something purely conceptual, something emergent from contact with the Legion itself. At the time, I still believed that understanding would protect me. The next document I reviewed was a personal log from a medici assigned to a cruiser transporting the World Eaters between campaigns. His entries began formally but grew progressively fragmented. In his early logs, he discussed the physiological effects of proximity stress, heightened cortisol, disrupted sleep cycles, minor hallucinations. But by the third voyage, he wrote something that made me pause the recording. They do not inspire fear. They create a kind of internal pressure, as if one's own unvoiced impulses were being brought closer to the surface. I cannot explain it. It is not suggestion. It is not intimidation. It is a change in the medium of thought. A change in the medium of thought. Not content. Not emotion. The medium. I play that line again and again. I realized then that I had begun speaking softly along with the recording, matching the cadence of the medici's voice. It was an unconscious imitation, but when I noticed it, I did not stop. I simply held my breath for a few seconds, steadied myself, and resumed the next entry. The medici reported that auxiliary crew members who spent prolonged time near the Legion developed a peculiar form of linguistic drift. Their vocabulary narrowed, their syntax tightened, their metaphors grew increasingly physical. He suspected this was a form of adaptive mirroring, humans attempting to model the cognitive patterns of Astartes. But he noted something else as well. The drift affected him too, even when he deliberately isolated himself. His final entry ended mid-sentence. There's a rhythm in all of it, a rhythm I can almost place, a pressure that wishes to resolve itself in a single direction. The audio cut out. There was no follow-up. Only a notation, medici reclassified, record sealed. I sensed my breath quickening, though I told myself it was simply the claustrophobia of the archive chamber. At this point in my investigation, I drafted a preliminary memorandum for my superiors, warning of a conceptual contagion that emerged from the World Eaters not as an intentional force, but as an unintended consequence of their internal architecture. I crafted it carefully, precisely, using neutral language to avoid alarm. I wrote that the Legion seemed to project, through behavior, lexicon, and presence alone, a self-propagating structure of thought. Yet I found, when I read my memorandum aloud for review, that the phrasing did not sound like my own. My sentences had grown longer, the rhythm slower, the emphasis peculiar. I had written, observation does not remain exterior to the subject. Observation is an invitation. That was not the way I typically wrote. That was not the conclusion I meant to draw. And yet, reading it, I found myself agreeing with it. The reviewing officer's only reply was a single line. Continue. Full transcription required. Exactly the same wording as before. Exactly the same absence of commentary. I felt a subtle unease then, as if I were not the only one being pulled deeper. Near the end of the second cluster of documents, I encountered something labeled simply, Testimony 34D. There was no author listed, no context provided. The transcript appeared incomplete, yet its formatting matched none of the standard archival protocols. It read like a confession, though the voice was neither accusatory nor despairing. Instead, it carried a strange serenity. The speaker claimed to have served as a bond officer assigned to the 12 Legion during an early compliance action. He insisted he had never witnessed overt brutality. Instead, he described a growing certainty that the Legion possessed a single internal vector, a trajectory of mind that the rest of the Imperium lacked. He insisted that proximity to them made one aware of the multiplicity of false choices in ordinary human decision-making. One line, in particular, unsettled me. They do not destroy autonomy. They reveal that autonomy was always a comforting fiction. I remember sitting back in my chair when I read that, pressing my fingertips to the bridge of my nose, telling myself that this was simply one more example of cognitive decay among overstressed personnel. But even then, a quieter part of me, a part whose origin I could not identify, wondered whether the bond officer had not decayed but clarified. And if so, what did that imply for me? As I conclude part 2 of this record, I must stress that I remain committed to objectivity. I note the changes in my thinking only as data, yet I cannot deny the pattern forming beneath the surface. The World Eaters are brutal, yes, but brutality is not the essence of what emanates from them. The threat is subtler, quieter, and infinitely more invasive. It is an idea, a system, a way of perceiving the world that consumes the uncertainty around it. I tell myself that continued investigation is necessary. I tell myself this is duty. I tell myself I choose to continue. And yet, late in my review tonight, I found myself whispering an unfamiliar sentence, a sentence I do not remember reading. There is no clarity without the cutting away. I do not know what it means yet, but I think I am beginning to understand why no observer before me ever requested termination of their assignment. I begin this third section by acknowledging a change I can no longer attribute to fatigue alone. The archive chamber feels different now. The lighting has not dimmed, the ventilation has not shifted, and yet each time I return, the air seems denser, carrying a faint pressure that rests just behind my sternum. I tell myself this sensation is psychosomatic, an artifact of prolonged isolation, but the thought feels rehearsed, as though borrowed from an earlier investigator who told himself the same thing. If this archive exerts a gravity, then I have crossed the point where resisting it requires more effort than allowing myself to be pulled deeper. Today's review focused on a series of administrative exchanges that, on their surface, seemed trivial. Interdepartmental requests, personnel transfers, supply discrepancies. Yet patterns emerged with a precision I find troubling. Every department connected, however indirectly, to the World Eaters displayed increasing delays in communication, as though their internal processes slowed in proportion to their proximity to the Legion. Officers who prided themselves on efficiency began responding with languid, spiraling prose. Short directives transformed into long reflections. The crisp language of military necessity softened into careful, oddly contemplative paragraphs. One quartermaster's reply to a routine inquiry was 6 pages long. 6 pages, responding to a form that required a single checkbox. In it, he discussed notions of weight, balance, and inevitability, words that made no sense in a logistical context, yet appeared with the rhythm of deliberate meditation. His final line unnerved me more than I expected. Some burdens are not carried. They are surrendered to. I flagged the message for psychological review, but the system bounced it back with a quiet notice. Pre-existing classification prevents further action. I had never seen that exact phrasing before. It implied not bureaucratic obstruction, but something more active, an intervention that preceded my involvement. And the deeper I dig, the more I see the subtle traces of such interventions, forms reassigned without explanation, redactions that do not match sensorium protocols, missing timestamps, slight inconsistencies in metadata. Not sloppiness, but intent. It is as though the archive edits itself, trimming certain threads, amplifying others, shaping the path of inquiry long before any investigator arrives to walk it. At first, I believed this to be the work of human hands. Now I am not so sure. The next set of materials consisted of auditory logs, short clips recorded by Vox units monitoring interactions between the World Eaters and auxiliary personnel. Most were mundane, almost disappointingly so. Orders given, confirmations received, footsteps, the hum of a ship's reactor. But interspersed among the ordinary were brief segments, seconds long, where the audio thickened, as though saturated by a low-frequency vibration. Technically, the distortion was within mechanical tolerance, but listening to it, I felt a sensation like teeth vibrating in my skull, a resonance not heard but felt. After several hours of exposure, I became aware of a subtle shift in my internal pacing. The rhythm of my breathing changed. My pulse synchronized to something I could neither name nor locate. I forced myself to take a break, to step into the corridor and steady my thoughts. But the corridor felt too still, too quiet, and the soundproofing seemed to swallow even the memory of noise. When I returned to the chamber, the first thing I did, without thinking, was play the last distorted clip again, not out of curiosity, out of alignment. Only after the third replay did I notice my fingers tapping against the console. A steady beat, for slow taps, then a pause, for more. A pattern I had not learned, a pattern I had not chosen. 8, always 8. I stopped immediately, folding my hands to still them. The pressure behind my sternum pulsed once, as though disappointed. I proceeded to the next file, a letter marked unsent, retrieved from the private cogitator of an administratum adept who had been tasked with cataloging the early campaigns of the 12 Legion. The letter, addressed to an unnamed confidant, read more like a confession than correspondence. The adept described an emerging sense that his own mind had become porous, that thoughts not his own were drifting in, not inserted, but permitted. He wrote, "It is not that they impose themselves upon us. It is that they strip away the illusions that prevent us from hearing what was always there." I found myself reading that line a second time, then a third. Each repetition felt easier, smoother, as though the words were fitting into a groove already carved within my thoughts. The adept's final paragraph was the one that lingered with me long after I closed the file. Their brutality is not an act. It is a vocabulary. We misunderstand because we fear the grammar of it. A vocabulary, a grammar. Brutality not as behavior, but as structure. Not as violence, but as a syntax through which reality could be reframed. I told myself that the adept's clarity was a symptom of breakdown, not insight, but I did not fully believe myself. The next segment of today's review presented the first outright anomaly. File we/12 contained a transcript of a psychological evaluation performed on a serf attached to the Legion for decades. His responses were steady, lucid, calm. Too calm. He spoke with a serenity bordering on beatific. He insisted he had never feared the Legion, never questioned them, never doubted that his place beside them was correct. When asked to explain what he meant by correct, he paused for several seconds before answering. Because they do not lie. They do not pretend that choice exists where it does not. The evaluator pressed him to elaborate, but the serf refused, repeating only that line, word for word, each time with the same rhythm. On the 7th repetition, something happened. The file tremors slightly, an audio-visual glitch, suggesting corruption. But it is not random. The serf's voice distorts, deepens, elongates, becoming almost harmonically layered, as if his words exist in several registers at once. They do not pretend that choice exists. Then silence. Not a cut, not an omission. Silence shaped like intent. I replayed that moment many times, convinced at first it was a technical artifact. But something in the silence troubled me. It felt engineered, as though the silence itself was communicating something, for those willing to perceive it. I am not certain when I first began leaning closer to the speaker, as though proximity would reveal meaning. I only know that when I pulled back, my forehead was nearly touching the console. I should note, objectively, that my dreams have begun to shift. Not nightmares, not visions, nothing overtly disturbing. But I wake with the sense of having engaged in long, slow conversations in a language composed entirely of impulses. A language without words, yet strangely articulate. I cannot recall the content, only the feeling of resolution, of many small uncertainties dissolving. 3 mornings in a row, I have woken with a faint ache behind my ears. 3 mornings in a row, I have told myself this is coincidence. And 3 mornings in a row, a quieter part of me has whispered otherwise. There's a rhythm in all of it. I did not think the Medicai's words would stay with me. And yet here they are. Before ending today's session, I reviewed one final document, a fragmentary observation log by an iterant scholar long believed lost. The final entry consisted of a single sentence, unfinished, its ending truncated by an abrupt recording stop. But the beginning was enough. Understanding the world eaters requires abandoning the assumption that the self is singular. The log ends there. The recording stops mid-breath. I sat in the dimness of the archive chamber long after the playback ended, staring at the projection of that sentence. The idea that the self might not be singular, that it might be divisible, permeable, or perhaps even unnecessary, echoed within me in a way I cannot fully dismiss. This marks the close of Part 3. I record these observations faithfully, as required. I tell myself the shifts in my perception remain within acceptable bounds, that my analyses are still grounded, that I remain capable of distinguishing observation from contagion. And yet, even as I prepare to shut down the console, I catch myself wondering something I should not. If the brutality of the world eaters is a language, then what is it teaching me to speak? There comes a point, so gradual it passes unnoticed, when observation ceases to be a window and becomes instead a mirror. I mark that threshold here, though I suspect I crossed it days ago, long before I allowed myself to acknowledge the shift. The evidence lay in my breathing, in the cadence of my thoughts, in the growing conviction that even my most careful doubts were beginning to arrange themselves into a pattern I had not chosen. If Part 3 documented the pressure building within the archive chamber, Part 4 concerns the pressure radiating outward, from the chamber, from the historical records, from the very concept of the 12 Legion, into the minds of those who were never meant to be touched by it. This section collects the testimonies of individuals who encountered the world eaters not directly, but peripherally. Scribes who handled sealed files, analysts who reviewed second-hand data, even citizens who merely lived on worlds once pacified by the Legion. Exposure at a distance. Contact through reflection rather than presence. A test of whether the idea behind the Legion was bounded or contagious. What I found unsettled me more deeply than any first-hand account. The first file, Civic Report 811/Delta, documented an incident on a compliant world where the world eaters had last operated decades earlier. No legionaries remained. Only the faint memory of their passage persisted. Yet city officials reported slow cultural drift among the population, a growing reverence for decisive, unilateral action, an impatience with deliberation, a subtle disdain for what they called hesitation masquerading as virtue. None of this was codified into law, nor was it traceable to propaganda. It was a shift in temperament, a gravitational pull toward simplicity, toward a worldview stripped of ambiguity. The report concluded with an observation that struck me with unexpected force. The people insist they have become more honest with themselves. The honesty is harsh, but they regard it as cleansing. Honesty, harshness, cleansing. These words echoed too closely the vocabulary emerging in the archive. I found myself repeating them softly, testing their weight. The cadence of the last one lingered on my tongue. Cleansing, a word that implies removal, reduction, purification by subtraction. A word that does not require violence to be violent. The next document, Memorandum 14/Hydra, contained a series of interviews with data archivists who had been assigned to reclassify materials involving the world eaters. These archivists had no contact with the Legion beyond handling text and recordings. Yet within weeks their colleagues noted shifts in demeanor. Their speech grew slower, more deliberate, their diction increasingly spare. One archivist reportedly began crossing out adjectives in other people's reports, insisting they were distractions from the core. Another stopped using metaphors altogether, stating they obscured the blade's edge of truth. One line from an interview caught my attention more strongly than the others. It is not brutality. It is subtraction. Brutality is merely the byproduct. Subtraction. The idea feels clean, almost elegant. Perhaps too elegant. I paused the file, trying to recall whether the term had appeared in earlier records. It had not explicitly. Yet the implication had been there all along, folded into the structure of the archive, waiting for someone to articulate it. I found myself appreciating the archivist's clarity. I did not note this as a symptom. Only later, hours later, did I realize the significance of that omission. At this point in my review, I began receiving system notifications, flagged anomalies in my biometrics, elevated heart rate, irregular breathing patterns during transcription, prolonged pauses between keystrokes. At first I dismissed them as intrusive diagnostics, the product of an overzealous cogitator, but the alerts grew more frequent, their phrasing more pointed. Operator cognitive patterns deviate from baseline. Interrupt review cycle. Recommend external evaluation. I ignored each prompt. To acknowledge them would have been to admit a loss of control, and I still believed fiercely that control remained with me. Yet I could not shake the subtle suspicion that the system was not concerned with my well-being. It was assessing whether I remained within acceptable parameters for continued exposure, whether I was still useful to the archive, whether I had aligned. The following material was more abstract. Satellite Analysis Packet VX 900, a collection of sociocultural measurements gathered from worlds where the World Eaters had once conducted campaigns. The data showed a curious trend. In the decades following the Legion's departure, local governance structures became increasingly rigid. Decision-making bodies shrank. Assemblies dissolved. Councils delegated more and more authority to single individuals or small groups. The worlds were not destabilized. If anything, they became more efficient. Crime decreased. Infrastructure improved. But public discourse narrowed dramatically. Divergent ideas faded. Debate quieted. The packet described this not as oppression, but as convergence. A convergence of thought. A convergence of desire. A convergence of will. The analyst responsible for compiling the data added a troubling footnote. There's no detectable mechanism for this shift. It appears emergent, self-organizing, as though the idea of the 12 Legion, once introduced into a world's memory, continues refining itself long after the Legion's departure. An idea, not a doctrine, not propaganda, not a deliberate transmission. A self-organizing idea. I set the packet aside, but the conclusion clung to me with a quiet persistence. If the World Eaters projected a cognitive gravity, then distance offered no protection. The gravity persisted in absence, like the lingering pull of an astronomical body long since collapsed. The next file, stenographic record 09/redline, detailed the testimony of a diplomat assigned to negotiate terms with the city-state conquered peacefully by the 12 Legion early in the Crusade. The diplomat had not encountered the Legion directly. He arrived years later, long after they had moved on. Nevertheless, he reported a disturbing sensation upon entering the city. It felt as though I had stepped into a chamber where someone had recently shouted, and the echo had not yet died. He described the citizens as calm, orderly, resolute, not fearful, not traumatized, but their expressions were oddly still, untroubled by contradiction, unburdened by indecision. When asked about their governance, they replied that their leadership was the only reasonable choice. When asked why, they simply repeated, "Because hesitation is suffering." Hesitation is suffering. I wrote the phrase unconsciously in the margins of my notes. Only later, reading back through them, did I see how neat the handwriting was, how straight the lines, how steady the stroke. The words did not look like something written in haste. They looked practiced. Near the end of today's review, I encountered a file I should not have been able to access, wnull/unindexed. There was no classification code, no author, No timestamp. The file opened without prompt, as though anticipating my presence. Inside was a single paragraph, composed in a voice I could not identify. A system does not spread by force. It spreads by resonance. Once its frequency is understood, others align themselves without instruction. The World Eaters are not a legion of warriors. They are a revelation in the shape of one. I sat motionless for nearly a minute, reading and rereading that paragraph, feeling a quiet, steady pressure build behind my ears. A pulse, a call, a suggestion, a recognition. For the first time, I felt not fear but agreement. Not full agreement, no, not yet, but the early shape of something like comprehension, rising in me with the inevitability of breath. As I conclude Part 4, I acknowledge that my role has changed. I am no longer merely cataloging the effects of proximity to the World Eaters. I am documenting my own drift. I do not know whether this drift is corruption, contamination, or correction. Each explanation remains plausible. Each feels incomplete. And yet one thought refuses to leave me, circling back with the calm persistence of a truth I am not prepared to name. If distance offers no protection, then perhaps the threat is not proximity to the World Eaters, but proximity to the idea of what they are. I leave this question here, unresolved, because resolution feels premature, or perhaps unnecessary. I am no longer certain when the shift occurred, though I can point to an hour, somewhere in the middle days after I began recording the previous entry, when I first noticed that my thoughts were no longer contained neatly within the boundaries I had once trusted. They moved outward or downward, or perhaps they merely stopped pretending to be confined. I would like to attribute the change to fatigue, to the unbroken cycle of reviewing sealed documents in the dim silence of a vault no one visits willingly. But even as I write that excuse, I know it is insufficient, a soft lie I offer myself, so that I may continue documenting what cannot comfortably exist. Something else has taken root, quieter than corruption, quieter even than faith. It began the moment I understood that the brutality of the World Eaters was not simply an effect of their circumstances, but a design, a method, an architecture of being. I do not mean that they were engineered as berserkers, though the historical data supports that claim easily enough. I mean that their violence forms a closed system that shapes them in ways they cannot detect, much as my own inquiry has shaped me in ways I can no longer deny. A system does not need permission, nor belief, nor comprehension. A system requires only participation, and participation is assured the moment you acknowledge its existence. This realization came to me through a mundane detail, an annotation in the margin of an old compliance report, written in a hand that was almost too calm. It stated, "Subject displays dissociation not as damage, but as alignment." That term, alignment, returned again and again as I read deeper. Alignment of thought, alignment of instinct, alignment of purpose. And though the annotator spoke of alignment as a symptom of exposure to butcher's nails, I began seeing it in myself, in the way my hours arranged themselves around the documents, in the way the silence of the sealed vault became a rhythm I depended on. For a while, I tried to resist that interpretation. I told myself I was simply acclimating to long-term isolation. But the documents grew more unsettling, not for their descriptions of carnage. Those were clinical, stripped of spectacle, but for their implications that the nails were merely an expression of something far older and vastly more diffuse, a hunger that replicated itself through systems, institutions, doctrines, habits of thought, and reflexive compliance. The more I read, the more I noticed how every file pointed back not to a figure or a battlefield, but to an idea, a quiet, persistent proposition that consciousness itself could be shaped into a weapon if one simply accepted that suffering is the purest form of clarity. And this idea did not shout, it did not command, it did not seduce with promises. It merely waited, patient and inevitable, as though it understood that most people resist an order but surrender gladly to a conclusion reached on their own. One document claimed that the earliest prototypes of the nails induced parallel perceptual channels, creating a sense of duality between action and observer, so that the subject experienced their own brutality as if from the outside. That phrasing troubled me deeply. duality, outside, observer. At first I wondered whether the researchers were attempting to describe a dissociative state, but then I noticed that the language seemed almost envious, as though the researchers believed that removing the self from the self was not damage but liberation. A liberation from what? I asked the question silently, repeatedly, until the vault lights flickered from low draw. A liberation from doubt, from conscience, from the illusion of autonomy, which so often hinders efficient systems. But as I turned these possibilities over, something quieter presented itself. Perhaps the liberation described was not freedom from anything, but freedom toward something, toward that symmetry of hunger I had glimpsed in patterns scattered through the files. A hunger that did not belong solely to the legionaries, nor to their primarch, nor even to the entity their rituals once invoked. It seemed instead to be woven into the architecture of obedience itself. I found myself revisiting earlier entries of this confession, tracing how my tone had shifted from certainty to curiosity to something else, a tension I cannot classify. I heard myself using phrases like we, alignment, design, as though my language had begun to adopt the rhythms of the documents I was trying to analyze objectively. This is how systems replicate, I suppose, not through force, but through familiarity. You spend long enough observing a pattern, and eventually the pattern begins observing you, fitting itself to the crevices of your thinking. The archivists who once warned me about empathetic contamination were correct, though their term now feels woefully insufficient. What I experience is not empathy. It is not fascination. It is a slow rearrangement, like furniture moved a fraction of a centimeter each night, until one morning you no longer recognize the room. One testimony, declassified only for internal research, described a world eater before full implantation of the nails. He wrote that he felt a pulling forward, a sense that a conclusion had already been reached somewhere outside him, and he was merely following the gravitational path toward it. He believed himself loyal. He believed himself sane. His transformation, he insisted, was not corruption but clarification. As I copied his words into my notes, I felt a strange kinship with him, not in what he became, but in the way he tried to articulate the moment before change, the threshold where choice becomes indistinguishable from inevitability. I wonder now whether every system that reshapes the mind presents its victims with the illusion of choice, or whether the illusion is unnecessary, a comfort we invent to avoid admitting that we were shaped long before we recognized the shaping. The longer I linger on this, the more my original purpose recedes into a kind of distant noise. I had come here to document, to classify, to remain outside the subject, but the subject does not permit an outside. It exerts a pressure subtle enough to ignore at first and overwhelming once perceived. And I am no longer certain whether this pressure is an intrusion or a revelation. Some part of me still insists that resistance is necessary, that the line between observer and observed must be guarded fiercely. But another part, the part that has grown louder each time I draw connections between the systems described in these files and the systems that have governed my own service, whispers that resistance may not only be futile, but misguided, that perhaps the brutality of the world eaters was not a perversion of their nature, but the purest expression of a truth we all avoid. If so, what does that imply about me? About anyone who studies these records? About those who built the structures that placed me here? The symmetry of hunger reveals itself slowly, but once recognized, it is impossible to forget. I end this section with an unease I cannot name, and a question that has begun to echo through every sealed page I open. If alignment is not corruption, then what, exactly, have I been resisting? It became impossible, sometime during the last uncounted days, to determine whether I was continuing this record by mandate, by habit, or by a kind of emerging compulsion that no longer resembles either. I tell myself it is duty, because duty is stable, measurable, sanctioned, but each hour spent in this vault unravels that certainty further. The documents I have been reviewing do not shout, do not threaten, do not command. They simply imply, and implication is a far more corrosive force than any overt coercion. It enters through the smallest cracks of interpretation and settles there until one's thoughts begin, almost gently, to rearrange themselves around a suggestion. And the suggestion that grows louder with every page is this: the brutality of the world eaters is not chaos, but structure. Not madness, but geometry of obedience so precise, so elegantly recursive, that it appears violent only because our eyes are trained to see freedom as natural rather than accidental. I have reached the point where I doubt that assumption profoundly. It was a transcript, barely legible, permanently stained by whatever fluid had once seeped across its surface, that finally disrupted the defensive layers I had constructed around my own mind. The transcript was a conversation between two researchers, both of whom were later redacted from existence, discussing not the neural mechanisms of the butcher's nails, but the psychological environment required for their successful integration. One line in particular has not left me since I read it. The subject accepts the nails most readily when they believe the implantation resolves a conflict they did not know they were struggling with. A conflict they did not know. A struggle without name. A question that predates the answer. This caught me off guard not because of its clinical detachment, but because it revealed something about my own inquiry. I, too, had approached this archive believing I was resolving an undefined conflict between duty and curiosity, between sanctioned truth and forbidden knowledge, between the structured loyalty I was issued at indoctrination and the faint suspicion that something crucial had been omitted. The nails resolve a conflict by erasing the illusion of contradiction. Violence becomes clarity, impulse becomes truth, hunger becomes identity. There is no debate within the mind, because the mind is redirected from the root. It is not forced, it is aligned. A system does not conquer its subject. It renders competing ideas obsolete. I see now that such alignment does not require machinery. Machinery is merely one expression. Another is doctrine. Another is institutional silence. Another is the unspoken contract that obedience will always be rewarded with meaning. We surround ourselves with systems that promise coherence, and we rarely question what is lost in the transaction. As I continued reading, I found more testimonies not from legionaries, but from logisticians, medici, strategists, those who served beside the world eaters rather than within them. Many reported a sensation I had previously dismissed as metaphor, a vibrational proximity, a sense that the brutality of the Legion broadcast something, not through sound or sight, but through a kind of psychic pressure that compelled those nearby to simplify their own thinking. Complexity became exhausting. Nuance became irrelevant. Doubt became unnecessary. This, I suspect, is the true contagion, the idea that certainty is the highest form of strength. I hesitate as I write this, because it mirrors the creeping shift I have noticed in myself. My earlier entries were filled with analysis, caution, self-correction. Now I find those gestures burdensome. I want to write with clarity, with finality, with the smooth inevitability of a conclusion already determined. And that impulse terrifies me, because it feels right, even as I recognize it may be the very transformation I was instructed to resist. It is not that I admire the world eaters. It is not that I excuse them. It is not even that I understand them. It is that, after weeks immersed in this archive's agonizing quiet, I see their condition reflected in miniature across every system we have built to regulate thought, loyalty, and purpose. We condemn their loss of autonomy while subjecting ourselves to subtler versions of the same architecture, rituals of obedience, curated ignorance, and the careful omission of alternatives. Perhaps the nails did not create monsters. Perhaps they merely made visible the mechanism that shapes all of us. Perhaps their brutality is only shocking because it is honest. This observation should repulse me. Instead, it produces a strange, hollow calm. Last night, or what I estimate to have been night, though the vault lights obey no natural rhythm, I discovered a file that had somehow been misclassified under environmental reports. It contained no warnings, no seals, no designations. A single page, a single sentence. I do not understand how it passed through classification unaltered, and I fear that the question itself is another trap laid by implication. The sentence read, "There is no freedom in a system, only the comfort of not knowing where its edges lie." I copied it into my personal notes without thinking. Only later did I realize how easily it had slid into my thoughts, like a blade sheathed in a wound already waiting to receive it. If the World Eaters were brutal, perhaps it was because they were denied the illusion of edges. Their system revealed itself entirely. Their hunger was not hidden. Their obedience was not disguised as virtue. The ultimacy of their alignment left no room for the self-deception we rely on. In that sense, they may have been the most truthful servants the Imperium ever produced. I find myself unable to determine whether that truth is abhorrent or admirable. I should stop here, but another thought presses insistently at the margins of my awareness, one I have resisted writing, not because it is dangerous, but because it feels like the first irretrievable step across a boundary I can no longer pretend I do not see. If the brutality of the World Eaters is a structure, a geometry of obedience, then the question is no longer why they succumb to it. The question is why we believe we have not. And if this archive has shown me anything, it is that the line between observer and participant is vanishingly thin and perhaps entirely imaginary, which leads to a final, unsteady thought I cannot yet fully articulate. What if the true forbidden record is not their transformation, but the realization that ours is already complete? I have delayed beginning this final entry longer than any that came before it, not out of fear, though fear still flickers, thin and mechanical, in the deeper parts of my mind, but because I wanted to be absolutely certain that what I am about to record is not the result of exhaustion, isolation, or the quiet psychological erosion that accompanies too many nights without the sun. I waited, hoping the sensation would pass. It did not. If anything, it strengthened, sharpened, settled with a confidence I no longer recognize as entirely my own. I must, therefore, record it now, before silence becomes indistinguishable from consent. The vault is not supposed to feel alive, and yet it does. Not alive in the biological sense, nor in any manner that suggests consciousness lurking behind the walls, but alive in the way a deep ocean trench might be considered alive. Pressure, darkness, gravity exerting themselves upon you until you can no longer tell whether the weight you feel is external or rising from within. When I first arrived, the silence was heavy. Now it feels attentive, listening, waiting, echoing a pattern I have come to know too well. It is the same attentiveness described in the earliest field reports on the World Eater's transformation, when observers spoke of the legionaries as though they were not simply violent, but inhabited by a logic deeper than instinct, deeper than doctrine, a logic that did not originate from any single source, yet shaped them with inevitability. I see now that what I mistook for possession was merely recognition. They recognized a truth within themselves that we spend our entire lives avoiding, a truth I can no longer retreat from. Hours ago, if time retains any meaning down here, I reviewed the first files I encountered when I began this assignment. I expected to find them naive, simplistic, the work of a mind that still believed itself untouched. Instead, I felt a strange dissonance, as though the earlier entries were written by someone else entirely. Their phrasing seemed cautious, indirect, almost apologetic. They read like the work of an individual concerned with boundaries, categories, distinctions between self and subject. All those distinctions have eroded, and with their erosion came a realization I resisted for as long as possible. The brutality of the World Eaters was not the source of the horror. The horror was the clarity that brutality revealed, because beneath the frenzy, beneath the violence, beneath the crimson haze and fractured thought, there was an idea, simple, elegant, horrifying in its precision. What if the self is nothing more than the system's last defensive reflex? What if what we call autonomy is merely the final illusion preserved to keep us from recognizing the totality of our alignment? The butcher's nails did not force obedience. They removed interference. They severed the fragile illusion of choice. They unmasked the system, and in that unmasking, they produced something honest, terrible, yes, but true in a way that our structured loyalties have never been. I cannot stop returning to a single phrase from one of the suppressed testimonies, a line that at the time seemed melodramatic, almost delusional. They did not make us killers. They made us see what had always been there. I dismissed it then. I cannot dismiss it now, because in the past days, as I reviewed the labyrinth of directives that brought me here, the layers of clearance that allowed me access, the subtle language embedded in my indoctrination. A question slowly crystallized, quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore. Why was I chosen for this assignment? Why me? Why now? Not because of my expertise. Others possess more. Not because of my loyalty. Many are more devout. Not because I sought this knowledge. I did not. I was chosen because the system knew I would yield. Because something in me was already aligned. This realization should have horrified me. Instead, it produced a sensation I have no name for, a hollow, sinking calm, as though a long unsuspected tension had finally released. The system is not external. It is not imposed. It is not alien. It is the shape our minds adopt the moment we stop resisting the quiet geometry that underlies all structures of control, military, political, spiritual, psychological. The geometry that whispers, "There's freedom in surrendering the burden of choice." A geometry that the world eaters embodied with such perfect, harrowing honesty that we chose to call them monsters rather than admit their revelation. Because if they were not monsters, if they were simply truthful, then what does that make us? I do not know how long I have been writing. The thought of stopping feels wrong, as though interruption would fracture a connection that has taken weeks to form. And yet I sense that this confession is approaching a point beyond which words will no longer be necessary, or possible. There is a final document I have not spoken of until now. I found it tucked between two irrelevant reports, unmarked, unregistered, written in crisp handwriting unlike any other in this archive. It contains no analysis, no data, no signature. Only a question written so cleanly, so confidently, that reading it felt like stepping into a moment that had been waiting for me long before I arrived. The question was, when you look upon the world eaters, do you fear what they became, or do you fear the part of you that recognizes it? I have tried to answer it. I cannot. Or rather, I can, but the answer shifts, slips, eludes classification every time I approach it. So I will leave this final entry unresolved, as all truths of this kind must remain unresolved, because I no longer know whether I stand on the side of resistance or revelation, whether what I have uncovered is corruption or awakening, whether the alignment taking shape inside me is something to fight against, or something I was always meant to understand. And as I close this record, as the vault hums with its faint attentive pressure, I am left with one last, lingering thought, a thought I cannot suppress, cannot disprove, cannot silence. Was the brutal life of the world eaters a descent, or simply the first honest step toward what we all already are? I leave that question for whoever finds this, if the archive lets you leave it all.